You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 384, recorded on June 20th, 2021. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me on the line, as always, from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
And special guest returning to the show after many years away, my friend in New Orleans, Justin. Justin, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Bill. It's great to be on. It was great to have you reach out to me.
Yes, so we reached out to you because we're talking about a New Orleans topic today, and unfortunately it's one that doesn't necessarily get a huge amount of attention in other places, and I don't even know if it gets that much attention in New Orleans, which is something we can talk about. But this week we're discussing the successful cross-racial New Orleans general strike of November 1892. And it happened in the waning days of the failed and very violent Homestead strike the same year in Pennsylvania, which has remained much more widely discussed in American labor history than the events we'll be talking about in New Orleans. And of course, across the South in 1892, the reaction to the end of Reconstruction and the imposition of Jim Crow was in full swing for at least a decade at this point. But of course, there were still areas where the situation was at least a bit different, and New Orleans had always tended to be kind of an exception to whatever was going on in the broader South. So there's obviously some similarities, but there's some key differences, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. As usual, our sources and notes will be posted with the episode in a PDF at arsenalfordemocracy.com. And as a succinct overview of the events that we'll be talking about today, I'll quote first from a summary at the Zinn Educational Project website. On November 8th, 30,000 factory and dock workers staged the 1892 New Orleans general strike, demanding union recognition, closed shops, wage increases, and more. They were joined by non-industrial laborers such as musicians, clothing workers, clerks, utility workers, streetcar drivers, printers, and most importantly, African-American and white workers united despite active attempts to divide the workers along racial lines. Now, we're going to be talking a lot more about all the specific details that were mentioned there, but I wanted to give that as an overview before we jump in to give some background. So, as we usually try to do with these strikes, we try to look at what was the situation happening in the city or state at the time, what were the conditions that led up to this, what were the demands, etc., and then we talk about the actual events. So here we're going to be doing some back and forth from my notes from the Wikipedia article and the various books or articles that article cites, as well as some extensive quotes from an article that Justin pulled from us from NewOrleansHistorical.org, a project by the University of New Orleans and Tulane University. And Rachel has also been digging up various articles and quotes from the time period itself, and we'll be weaving those in, as well as we get into the narrative of what happened. So, for background, in May of 1892, streetcar conductors in New Orleans won a smaller strike demanding a closed shop, which, as we've talked about on previous episodes, means the hiring of union members only. And they also won a shorter work day. This success sent a powerful ripple through the working class of New Orleans, which rushed to form union locals across a wide range of occupations, inspired by that victory. By the end of the summer of 1892, the city had 49 unions, many affiliated to the American Federation of Labor, although the AFL would not be taking the lead on the events of the fall of 1892, given their racist segregated union policies and orientation toward craft unionism. And that's something we've talked about on previous episodes, and we'll certainly circle back to it later in this episode. The overwhelming majority of these unions in New Orleans were new that year, and 30,000 workers formed a Working Men's Amalgamated Council. Now, Justin, could you tell us a little bit more about the Working Men's Amalgamated Council in New Orleans in 1892?
Yeah, it represented just a broad swath of the employees in the city. A lot of white craft workers, in addition to a lot of black unskilled labor, musicians, and everything from musicians and carpenters to dock workers were all a part of this union. And they wanted what was typical of the time: a shorter work day and higher wages in a closed shop. That was pretty much what their primary demands were. Now, individual unions may have asked for their own things, but the core was shorter workday, higher wages, closed shop for their unions.
Now, the Amalgamated Council, representing all these different unions, they did a lot of preparation work in the lead up to this strike. Something we've talked about on a lot of past episodes is that the strikes with preparation tend to go a lot better than the ones that didn't prepare adequately for this. So one of the things in the source that you pulled, Justin, notes that the council basically figured out that this was whatever strike was going to happen later in the year was going to affect everybody, even if their individual union didn't go out on strike. And they needed to have a sort of general fund to be able to support the workers if they were to go on strike. So they pooled together before any subsequent strike action happened after that streetcar strike. They pooled together $7,000. And that gave them this pretty huge strike fund for the time period to be able to sustain their workers over what ended up being quite a short strike as well, which I think was critical. One thing we've talked about on other episodes as well is just the idea that if you have a strike that drags on, you're probably not going to win. If you have a strike that wins almost immediately, that's it. Well, the shorter to victory, the better, basically. So as we said, we've got all these different local unions. We've got this Working Men's Amalgamated Council. And then within that, we have sort of three really big unions that not only form the core of this emerging labor movement in New Orleans, but also end up triggering the strike that subsequently turns into a general strike. And this was the so-called Triple Alliance of racially integrated unions representing the Teamsters, the Packers, and the Scalesmen. Now, I didn't really know what Scalesmen were, so I looked that up. They're also known as Weightmasters, and these are the professionals who measure bulk commodity shipments accurately, basically to try to reduce scamming and make sure that everyone has the same equipment and things like that for measuring, whether it's coffee beans or whatever. And of course, New Orleans, as we know, a huge port city where you have stuff coming into the United States, stuff going out of the United States, and a lot of it's in these bulk unfinished commodities. So you got to have a pretty significant number of people who were working in that industry. Now, the Teamsters were majority black. They were integrated union. And these other two unions, although they were integrated, the Packers and the Scalesmen, they were majority white. According to Daniel Rosenberg's 1988 book, The New Orleans Dock Workers, Race, Labor, and Unionism, 1892 to 1923, which tracks the New Orleans interracial union's careful internal decision-making in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to fairly distribute work assignments and union leadership positions to both white and black workers under a system referred to as half and half by the locals. Now, Justin, could you tell us a little bit more about the Scalesmen and Packers unions in contrast with the Teamsters?
Well, like we mentioned, or like I mentioned when I was talking about the Working Man's Amalgamated Council, the Scalesmen and Packers were skilled laborers. The Scalesmen, like you said, they weighed commodities and they worked on the docks primarily and in warehouses. And their job was to weigh commodities and make sure that those commodities were accurate to keep scamming down, to keep people from getting over on those who were buying commodities from them. The Packers loaded everything into these shipping vessels to go out, and they were just as important as the Scalesmen, because you had to know how to load certain items correctly. If you didn't, that's the same thing today. If you load a truck and you don't load it correctly, or if you pack groceries and you don't pack them correctly, it's going to be a major problem when you're moving those items to a vehicle or bringing them into your home. So, yeah, those two groups were integral to the shipping of goods and services from the port of New Orleans out into the world in general.
And the Teamsters?
The Teamsters were unskilled labor. They were classified as unskilled laborers, but without them, your property doesn't go to where it needs to go. They would take the loaded carts, wagons, what have you, and they will move them out. It was a primarily black group, And as such, they seemed to be looked down on by business owners, but they were integral to what was happening in the city at that point.
So the Triple Alliance, obviously representing this fundamental choke point in the trade infrastructure of New Orleans, they decided to go on strike in late October of 1892, and their core demands were seeking a 10-hour workday, overtime pay, and union shops. So could you walk us through sort of the beginning of their strike just by these three unions before they were joined by other unions in solidarity?
Well, they made their point. They brought their points to their bosses and to the ruling class or what have you, the employer class, and basically stated their demands and threatened to walk out. The employee class, the banks, the foundries, employ hotels, merchants, all these people, they were they were petrified at the idea that so soon after the Civil War, so soon after all of the frustrations with Reconstruction, that not only were white workers rising up against them, but black workers were joining them and they were working together so cohesively. And I think for a lot of people in this merchant class, the that these workers would be so well organized despite these differences that they tried to sow based on race, it it scared them. It scared the hell out of them. But their demands were pretty clear. Overtime pay after 60 hours of work. They wanted a closed union shop. They wanted shorter work days, which meant 10-hour work days. I can only imagine what how these same employers would have reacted later on during strikes for 8-hour work days. So, but yeah, those were basically the primary things that they wanted. Just they wanted those three fundamental things, and the workers initially it was only 2 or 3 thousand workers that went on strike, but they were powerful because of what they did. Nobody else was going to go out on the docks and weigh coffee beans coming in from another part of the world, or deal with loading items onto wagons and bringing them out.
Now, at this point, usually what happens in these strikes, as we've talked about, is that you get the management saying we're not going to negotiate, and they start, especially in the South, but we also have seen examples in the North, they start putting together quite a violent response, usually backed by state force. And it looked like at the beginning that this was going to be the same playbook, although it didn't end up really playing out that way. There was no initial flexibility on the part of the business community. That did lead to the general strike. But there were certain steps that the employers tried to take in the opening days of this strike that looked like it was going to escalate to quite a violent situation.
It seemed like they tried to use the press. Newspapers would put out news during the strike itself of violent mobs of black workers assaulting people, things like that. They basically told the white workers that you're better than them, they're going to drag you down, things of that nature. But members of white workers that knew better talked to their brethren and basically said, hey, they're not the enemy. They're not who's going to keep money out of our pockets and keep us working long hours. It's the people in power, and we have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and that was very successful, it seemed like, in terms of maintaining discipline in the ranks and not breaking. I mean, you had the employers getting together, the railroad executives and the cotton, sugar, rice commodity exchange leaders and so forth, and they're pooling together their money to do strike breaking and maybe pay some guys to go around terrorizing the workers. And they decided that the New Orleans Board of Trade was going to represent their interests. But as you said, Justin, the Triple Alliance was able to hold firm and not get scared, not cut any side deals. You didn't have the white-led unions going off and cutting a deal to exclude the black-led unions and so forth. And that sort of communication within the unions and people talking to each other and talking about the importance of standing firm across these racial lines seemed to be really critical to making this happen. Now, at this point, there doesn't seem to have been, and this is something we'll circle back to in a bit, but there doesn't seem to have been a tremendous crackdown or huge use of force against these strikers, which is interesting. And I'm not completely sure why that is. We can get into it when we get into the general strike about what happened with that. But it seems like maybe they were genuinely scared of the situation in terms of how vulnerable the entire economy of New Orleans was from just these three unions. Maybe they thought that they could resolve this without going to those lengths. I'm not really sure, but there's a lot of tough talk from these newspapers going on and on about how there were supposedly all these rampaging mobs of strikers, and that didn't really fit with the reality, but you also didn't have the other side seemingly doing a whole lot there. It seemed to be mostly relatively quiet, and after a couple weeks of nothing really being resolved and just sort of being an impasse and there was no negotiations happening, we start to see a push toward a general strike in solidarity with the Triple Alliance's strike. And this was coordinated by the Cotton Screwmen's Union, the Cotton Yardmen's Union, the Printers, the Boilermakers, and the Car Drivers Union. And of course, New Orleans would have been a major port for the cotton trade as well. That would have been another commodity example. And so you can see that there were, from this initial seed of these three really critical, workforce unions that could get in the way, we see this bottleneck expanding to similar related industries and a few other industries out of that group of those nearly 50 unions in New Orleans. So Justin, those were sort of the five main allied unions that were running this general strike when it was decided to undertake this. And it was, as we said earlier, they had all kind of realized that whatever happened later in the year was going to affect all of them. So it was kind of a natural extension that everyone had been working together and communicating with each other to say, okay, let's try a general strike here. But it really ended up encompassing quite a huge range of occupations, which were, not cowed in the face of those media reports and so forth. So when the Working Men's Amalgamated Council decides to go on a general strike on November 8th, we get those, 25 to 30,000 workers going on strike. And this was just a huge swath of people from New Orleans. So could you tell us a little bit about who went on strike at that point?
You had people that were straight from Africa, Caribbean, from the Caribbean, Spanish-speaking peoples, French peoples, and other folks of European descent. They included 45 different locals. You had screwmen, but you also had freight handlers, coachmen, musicians, warehousemen, joiners, carpenters, grain shovelers, plasterers, pile drivers, pretty much people from all across New Orleans. I want to say it was some 45 locals that all went on strike, including gas and electric workers. So when night fell in the city, it fell into dark. You can't stop anybody from protesting. Nothing moved, nothing was delivered. The city just went into a standstill.
Now, Rachel, I wanted to bring you in here. thinking back over all of these episodes that we've been doing on these strikes from this time period in the early 20th century, I don't remember us getting into a discussion of these grid workers from the natural gas industry and the electric grid, which would have been probably relatively new at that point. I don't remember them getting involved in these strikes. And in fact, apparently, there was a lot of pressure on those unions to not get involved in this strike. And that this was going to be, illegal or a bad idea or whatever. And they just went ahead and did it. And that seemed to really show that the half of the workforce in this city that was going on strike at this point was able to shut down the entire city's economy. Rachel, do you recall anything like this in any of the previous episodes that we've done?
No, and I'm trying to think back to one of the other major general strikes in San Francisco with the dock workers starting that strike. And I seem to recall that they kind of went to like a skeleton crew of essential services, which it seems like this strike completely shut everything down, including deliveries. So in San Francisco, there was still like food deliveries. And so I'm guessing that gas infrastructure was probably seen as part of that essential service, which it's interesting to see the contrast between that general strike and this one. Maybe that also helped keep like law enforcement down. If you can't see, you can't beat some people's heads in. So I'm wondering if that is kind of a part of that lack of response, that lack of escalation from local law enforcement.
And it certainly seemed to be the final coup here that forced a settlement of this strike, was that they were able to, in a matter of days, from November 8th to November 12th, basically win this strike by just completely shutting down New Orleans, with even essential services cut off, as you said. So I thought that was interesting, and definitely another key distinction between this strike and a lot of the other ones that we've talked about. So, Justin, at this point, the Board of Trade, negotiating on behalf of the management of these various companies, is fully in panic mode, trying to figure out how to circumvent this strike. And at that point, of course, you start getting companies being ready to cut side deals to try to resolve this. What were some of the extreme measures that they went to in the absence of apparently much in the way of state repression to try to resolve this strike?
They offered special higher wages for anyone to come forward. Only 59 people came forward to do that. Then they started making calls out to other parts of the country, the other parts of the South, to Birmingham and Mobile, to Memphis and Galveston. But a lot of people declined to come forward to serve as scabs on this strike.
Yeah, and Rachel, I know you looked into this a little bit because we were kind of wondering, you had a new governor, a new mayor, Governor Murphy J. Foster, a vicious white supremacist over most of the rest of his tenure, really made New Orleans and Louisiana as a whole very unfriendly and exclusionary to black people, despite them representing about half the population of the state or thereabouts, and preventing them from exercising any political power. But at this point, he didn't seem to take really strong action here. And similarly, the new mayor of New Orleans, John Fitzpatrick, also didn't really take particularly strong action. And this seems to have also been a factor in why there was so little interest in people coming either from within or outside of New Orleans to serve as strike-breaking scab labor. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I found a Tulane University article that kind of discussed this a little bit. So in response to pressure from the business community and the press, Mayor Fitzpatrick did agree to declare martial law, but he refused to offer police to protect scabs. So that seems like a super major kind of blow against the business class. In other strikes that we've talked about, the police are definitely there to protect capital and to protect those scab workers. And so the Board of Trade then appealed to Governor Murphy Foster to send in the state militia. And they kind of pointed to those earlier press articles, kind of pointing out the racist coverage in the New Orleans press that was trying to paint the black workers as violent, saying that they're assaulting white people. And even this press, it did kind of spur the governor to action. And the militia did arrive at November 10th, which is the midpoint of the general strike. But they found New Orleans to be so exceptionally quiet that they withdrew the next day. So I think the fact that the local law enforcement wasn't there to escalate the violence, to crack down on the strikers, really didn't provide that impetus for the state militia to come in and violently suppress the strike action. The strikers were able to be so anti-violent that they basically like judo flipped the state militia into leaving, just through this pacific, nonviolent, passive resistance.
Now, Justin, in many of these strikes in this time period, you would see the soldiers end up getting deployed to work as strike breakers. I think it's probably a little bit different when we're talking about a state guard compared to federal troops because, of course, the state guard, similar to a lot of National Guard people today, but even more so back then, tended to be sort of a volunteer group of people who weren't necessarily trained in these specialized labor areas, and they had other stuff that they needed to be doing too, so they weren't really interested in lengthy deployments. It seems like that there was some attempts to use the state guard as strike breakers, and that didn't really go anywhere in this event in New Orleans.
It absolutely did not. They brought in the state militia to work on the docks, to basically do a lot of the skilled labor, which was odd in and of itself. But it turns out that when they got there, they didn't know what they were doing. 2, they were outnumbered. 3, they just generally did not want to butt heads with the protesters, with the strikers. So it didn't work. And the strike was able to continue on without much resistance from them.
I'm also thinking about the scale of this too. And I think the fact that it was 25 to 30,000 strikers in one city may have also served as a pretty significant deterrent to taking action. As you said, you don't want to butt heads with that many people when you're basically a volunteer good old boy, probably from upstate, who showed up thinking this was going to be, 1 or 2 night thing, and then you'd leave, maybe fire off some warning shots, and that would be it. And all of a sudden you realize that the city is plunged into darkness, there's no supply lines happening, and you are completely surrounded by a cross-racial, highly organized group of strikers numbering in the as many as 30,000. I mean, you can see why they might have said, well, in the absence of any actual violence and chaos here, we might as well just leave and get out of here rather than making the situation worse. Now, that's some speculation on my part. I don't know if that's exactly what their rationale was, but I think that seems logical to me. So, Justin, with the withdrawal that Rachel mentioned of basically, within a day of the state guard troops, the Board of Trade had to essentially acknowledge that this was over and they had lost and they needed to get the economy moving again. So they didn't agree to everything, but what did they agree to with the strikers?
They gave them a shorter workday, so they got their 10-hour workday, and they got a 25% wage increase. Yeah, and they made some gains, but one of the things they wanted they didn't get, and that was the closed shop. The closed shop, which would have been full recognition of their unions.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, it's very impressive that they were able to mount this general strike, that they were able to get this pretty huge wage increase, that they were able to get their shorter work days. You get these Sherman Antitrust Act violation lawsuits from the federal government, or prosecutions from the federal government against the strike leaders that don't really go anywhere and eventually get withdrawn. So to my mind, we're looking at a win here. as you said, they didn't get the closed shop demand that would have prevented non-union workers from being employed. But I mean, this was a pretty significant opening blow. And I think at this point, it's worth kind of talking about how it was viewed at the time, how it was viewed after. So the general strike was considered a success by its participants in the immediate aftermath, and it should probably be considered a success today as well. Even Samuel Gompers of the National AFL said at the time, quote, "To me, the movement in New Orleans was a very bright ray of hope for the future of organized labor and convinces me that the advantage which every other element fails to succeed in falls to the mission of organized labor. Never in the history of the world was such an exhibition. With one fell swoop, the economic barrier of color was broken down." But there was an immediate national propaganda effort to paint the strike as a complete failure, basically so that it couldn't serve as a model to other industrial communities across the country. On December 12th, 1892, the New York Times, which we've frequently referred to on this show for its very hostile coverage of unions, blared an editorial headline, quote, "Labor's defeat in New Orleans, the victory of the employers complete," end quote. This view, if taken seriously, would have come as a shock to the employers in New Orleans, who were furious at their defeat at the time. However, historians of the period from the 1890s until the Great Depression, much like their lost cause revisionism of Civil War Reconstruction and antebellum history in the South, made a concerted effort to describe the strike as a massive failure. This likely contributed to the strike fading from view and from critical reevaluation until the mid-20th century by labor historians such as Philip Foner. So Justin and Rachel, I know you had gathered together some contemporary quotes to offset that sort of revisionist history from the right, basically people who were either celebrating the results of the strike or in some cases weren't happy about that result but had to acknowledge that that's what had happened. So I'll go to you first, Justin. You had a few quotes from the time period of people describing this huge victory in New Orleans in the fall of 1892.
Yeah, this quote is from John Swinton, and this is from about a month after the strike. "We must take a broad view of the warlike operations of which these strikes were incidents. Skirmishes may be lost by a regiment which may win. Regiments may be defeated in the battles of a triumphant campaign. Campaigns may end in dismay for the army that conquers in the war. Be not in haste. This thing is not over yet. The forces of the advance have but begun to learn their drill. Serious revolutions move in large arcs along a course which is orderly, though it may appear to be zigzag." And then I have another quote here. And I think it's also, if I remember right, it's also from John Swinton. "The 50,000 brave men who in the 6 great strikes and many lesser strikes of this year stood the enemy's onslaughts, rendered a service of incomputable worth to the working masses of the United States. If they had failed to strike a blow before they fell, what do you think would have happened elsewhere? Do you doubt that cowardice would have invited further reprisals? That the conditions of labor would have been harder in other places and other industries? If, therefore, many of the hostile schemes of the enemy were checked or balked this year, due credit for this must be given to the strikers who resisted aggression, set their comrades on the watch by raising the alarm. I ask you to bear it in mind, to hold it in grateful memory, that American labor in general has been benefited by the action of the brave strikers in Homestead, Buffalo, and New Orleans, who took the field in its defense and fell while battling for a few of the items of its rights."
Now, I want to comment here. This is, as Justin's just read, a quote from a labor editor addressing the National Convention of the AFL. And even here, you can start to see the seeds of where this narrative that this was a failure gets planted, because they're rolling it together with things like Homestead strike, which did end in failure, where it was like, oh, it was so brave, they fought and then they lost, and that's okay. And kind of rolling these together and saying, oh, they got some of the things they wanted, but not everything. And therefore, they fell, but it was very important. And it's like, no, this was a successful strike, unlike some of those other ones that happened that year. They didn't get everything they wanted, but this was a successful strike. And I think part of this also has to do with something we've talked about on the show before. And I know Rachel's getting to that very soon, which is that the AFL in general tended to be a lot less radical than a lot of the other unions and union organizers at the time. It tended to be focused on craft unions. It tended to be averse to general strikes and so forth. And you can see the seeds starting to get planted here of saying, we're just not going to get involved in this kind of thing. We're not going to regard this as this huge victory that it was. And that's a bit troubling, and it fits in with that revisionist historian narrative. But you can also see here that they were acknowledging that there had been a pretty big success in New Orleans, and that they had, accomplished quite a lot, and at minimum definitely made sure that the situation wasn't getting worse in New Orleans. And I think when you're talking about 25% wage increases and shorter hours and so forth, you're definitely looking at outright improvements. Rachel, before we get into talking about that sort of craft union versus industrial union dichotomy that we've talked about on so many previous episodes, could you talk a little bit about, again, the view in New Orleans at the time by people who were not necessarily sympathetic to this strike, but had to basically acknowledge that it had been a success?
Yeah, I found some headlines on the New Orleans Historical Society website. And so on November 11th, 1892, the Times Democrat said, "This morning, at an early hour, after nearly the entire night spent in negotiations, the differences between the employers and the striking employees were practically settled. The basis of settlement is that the strike is to be called off. Questions as to wages and hours of work are to be arbitrated. The employers are to take back old employees as far as possible without displacing new men whom it is desired to retain. All dealings are to be directly between employers and employees and applicants for employment." And here I want to emphasize this last sentence. "The entire community is to be congratulated on the happy result." And then the next day, the Times Democrat had another headline, "A satisfactory arbitration of the wages and hours of the Triple Alliance." So these headlines really seem to contradict that failure narrative that did show up later. It seemed that even though the press was really trying to smear the workers, they were pretty satisfied and happy with how the strike ended and resolved.
Now, I know you dug up another interesting research piece. This is from 1983, looking back at one of the unions that was involved in this general strike. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I found an article titled "The Typographical Union and the New Orleans General Strike of 1892." This was in the journal Louisiana History, the Journal of the Louisiana Historical Association. And it was written by Bernard A. Cook. And like you said, it was the autumn 1983 edition. So the Local 17 of the International Typographical Union was one of those unions that voted to join the general strike. And they did this despite having no strike clauses in their contracts. And they even joined the strike against the advice of national leadership. I do want to note there was also a minority faction within the union who opposed these sympathy strikes, and they favored a more narrow scope of organizing within the confines of and in the interests of their own trade. The article did point out that the Typographical Union was one of the oldest unions in New Orleans and one of the best organized. So this article pulled together some primary quotes from the time. The Typographical Union kept really good meeting minutes, and so they were able to find these minutes and include them in the article. So on a November 1st, 1892 meeting, the printer said the issue wasn't, quote, "one of mere matter of hours and wages, but one of recognition of unionism," capital U, unionism. So the dominant philosophy of this union was that workers had to be united across industries, across trades. And then a few days later, at a November 6, 1892 meeting, the point was reiterated by the local secretary, Isaac Hinton, quote, The merchants still obstinately refuse to recognize any committee or committees emanating from any union. They're willing to confer with working men singly or in any number, provided they eschew unionism. The question then is simply this: shall unionism be sustained in New Orleans? So they really saw it as an existential threat to unionism in New Orleans if they did not join it in this general strike. And I wanted to also quote from the conclusion. The division within New Orleans Typographical Local 17 concerning the general strike has more than just local or momentary significance. At odds here were two conflicting visions of the labor movement, one narrow and restrictive, with workers combining to advance their limited interests within the context of their exclusive craft, the other general and expansive, which viewed the labor movement as a whole. This expansive view, however, in which workers saw their advancement occurring within the context of the advancement of the whole working class, a vision in which an injury to one was regarded as an injury to all, in general gave way in the country as a whole, as it did in New Orleans in the wake of 1892, to a more pragmatic vision of the labor movement. And I think that's something that really contributes to the decline of the labor movement that happened in the subsequent decades. There was this narrowing of the vision of what unions were for. And it's basically a repudiation of the successful strategies that happened in this strike. There was a broad swath of workers that were seeing their advancement as something that was connected, like every worker was connected, and one's advancement led to the advancement of all. It's really kind of unfortunate that groups like the AFL really contributed to this narrow viewing and this kind of pragmatic paradigm for the labor movement as a whole.
Now, before we wrap up here, Justin, I wanted to go back to you at this point. You are a lifelong, I think, right, Louisiana person. And
yes, I've lived here my entire life. I've lived in New Orleans. I went to high school in New Orleans, and I've lived here since 1998.
Is this something that you had heard about before we started working on this episode?
Not at all. I'd never heard of this. And like I told you when we started working on this, I hadn't heard of this strike, nor had, and there are other bits and pieces of history here in Louisiana that if I heard anything about it, it was very little that I heard about in passing. Another one being the German Coast Slave Revolt, which is interesting because I grew up in the area where that slave revolt took place.
Mm-hmm. What do you think it is that makes this strike so unusual and so distinct, not only from the rest of what was going on in the South, but also what was going on in the rest of the country at the time? And do you agree with the sort of view that the reason that you don't hear about this one that much is through a deliberate strategy of downplaying the success here in order to avoid it serving as an example for others?
Well, I mean, if we look at what's going on in the country right now, where there's this huge swath of people who've decided that they're not going to go back into their offices, they're going to walk away from whatever job that they're working, whether it's whether it's an office job or whether it's a service industry position, because they're not being paid well, they're not being respected by their employer, things like that. You look at those things, and then you look at the way a lot of states are now at-will states. They go through great measures to keep people from organizing, and they give all the power to the employer versus the employee giving anything to the employee. Basically, it's this strike, being as far back as it was, still serves as an example that proper organization and proper, and unifying behind a common goal and not faltering can be effective. You have a lot of employers that are afraid of that kind of thing, which is why Amazon workers were having to go to court to get the opportunity to unionize in Alabama.
What do you think was the unique X factor with New Orleans in 1892 compared to the other places?
So it's the same thing with a lot of other things. Folks from New Orleans will always tell you that, New Orleans is a lot different from Louisiana. New Orleans, as it stands, and this strike will illustrate, native New Orleanians and natives of southeast Louisiana in general tend to rally around each other and tend to close ranks around each other. We can fight each other. We can talk bad about each other, but outsiders aren't allowed to do that. Outsiders can't come into New Orleans and tell us that we're bad people. You give us space to deal with our problems ourselves. And that crosses gender lines, that crosses racial lines, that crosses any barrier that society puts up. And this strike is an example of that, because it was people from all walks of life, from pretty much every racial category in this city at the time involved in this strike, and they stood together.
Rachel, I want to go to you at this point as we close here. There's two themes that I see, and I want to get your thoughts on this, that make this such an amazing example that we should be studying and thinking about even today, which is at the beginning of the year, or at least in May of 1892, you have this smaller strike that's a success, and that victory seems to be what really builds power very rapidly around unionism in New Orleans. And that secondarily, as Justin just alluded to a few minutes ago, the planning and preparation work for this was incredible. And they hadn't necessarily decided in the summer, oh, we're going to do a general strike later, but it was understood that they had to all be kind of pulling together, pooling their resources together, because anybody that went on strike next, it was going to be at least at minimum a test case for their own situation, if not something that was going to spread wider. And within a couple of weeks, everyone had pretty much decided, even when they were advised not to, that, you know what, the time is right. We've got to go on general strike. This wasn't spontaneous, though. It was something that they had been planning and preparing for over the course of the year. I was wondering about your thoughts on those sort of themes.
Yeah, I agree that those are major points that led to the success of the strike. Also, I agree with Justin completely that it was that closing of ranks, because in other even cross-racial strikes that we've talked about, they were able to pit like the native workers versus immigrant labor. And in this case, even the immigrant labor joined in as well. And so it was really important that all of these workers were prepared to go on strike in sympathy with each other. And there wasn't a good way for the capitalist class to find that wedge, that point, that crack in the armor that they could wedge in and widen those divisions.
It seems like an incredible level of solidarity and preparation to get to a situation where out of, 100,000 workers in the city or what have you, that you get only about 50 people willing to scab. I mean, that's just nothing comparable comes to mind in any of the previous strikes that we've talked about.
Right. And I think that's where the immigrant workforce was so important, because I think that was a big source of scab labor in other strikes that we've talked about. So that it is super impressive. And I wonder if the fact that there wasn't local cop protection also kind of made the workers think twice about joining in and scabbing.
Rachel, thank you so much for being on this week.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
And Justin, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this fascinating episode of history from your own backyard.
Thank you for inviting me, Bill. It was a pleasure.